Okay, well look, a very good evening to you. Welcome to GV311. This is the first week, an introductory week actually. I'm Tony Travers, I'm a professor in the government department, and I'm responsible for GV311. Perhaps before we start, I should just explain one or two things. We've got cameras in here because we want to capture this in a slightly upmarket way in terms of the production values, as opposed to the excellent lecture capture that you'll get for other lectures. We'll edit it, and this gives you an opportunity to ask questions and get them captured as well if you want them, and you'll be able to look at these lectures online as well as through the lecture. Well, actually, certainly online, you'll be able to look at these lectures after the event. Can I just, and the other thing is last year we opened the lectures up beyond the school. Not one or two people here this evening from beyond the school, I detect. But can I just take a show of hands from the GV311 cohort? I want to embarrass you all. Right, okay, and well, that's fine. Actually, let's just give me your names, just so I meet for the first time. And Matthew, who is going to be taking classes, will also then have a sense of who you are as well. You'll see him on Friday. You may know him already, of course. Forgive me.
My name's Sam.
Sam.
Chan.
Chan.
John.
Okay.
Alex.
Alex. Jimmy.
Greg.
Kinder. Good.
Chris.
Sorry. Sorry. Okay. Well, I'll say this. What I want to do this week anyway is just to introduce the course. This is like a way of explaining what's going to be in the course over the coming... Yes, sorry.
Does that mean these lectures will be recorded on Moodle every week?
Yes. I hope that's not a problem. And no, they will be every week, not just this week. And that means you can watch them again. We've got... dare I say it, embarrass my colleagues, slightly higher production values than on the lecture capture, I hope. It certainly was last year. Anyway, what I want to do this week is simply to introduce the course. I'm very happy if you want to ask a question. There are one or two points in what I'm going to say where I'll pause, where you could join in, make a comment, whatever. But I just want to go through what will be in the course over the next 19 weeks. We've got 19 weeks straight. Mixture of, I'll be doing some of these lectures. We've got guest lectures for most of the other weeks. And then we'll have a revision slot at the beginning of the summer term. The purpose of the course is to provide an analytical understanding of the following things: aspects of the principles that underpin British government and politics, political parties, elections and representation, the origins and operations of the institutions of British government. Many of these you will doubtless have studied before, but we will take that a bit further, I hope. Some modern historical developments, how, you'll see, I'll go through this in a bit more detail in a minute, how the institutions of government evolved. We'll be looking at the judiciary and the court system, the policy-making process, public finance, including taxation and expenditure, and of course, criticisms of all the above and at proposals for reform. So that's very broadly what the lectures will be covering. Some 2 lectures will cover some of these topics, 1 in other cases. There are things I haven't listed here. Some other themes. We'll be looking at party politics. Professor Patrick Dunleavy will do this, the decline of mass party memberships and Britain's move to a multi-party system, just before Christmas. And then the role of the media, looking at the traditional media versus the new media and their impact within British politics, also at ownership and regulation, their impacts on political life. We'll have a couple of weeks on accountability and financial responsibility, looking at select committees, Parliament's more general role in scrutinising the executive, and at possible roles and improvements of this system. And then last but not least, well actually not quite last, nearly last but not least, the British government's relations with Europe, the can't live without relationship that Britain appears to have with Europe, and also at the the spectrum from the federalism that some EU countries appear to want versus the threat of withdrawal, which is Britain's counter to that. And in fact, beyond this, because it seemed to be an appropriate thing, the last lecture of next term, that is just in March, we will look at the British general elections past, because if you think about it, that lecture will run in March, just before the general election. We have Professor Vernon Bogdanor, the great constitutional expert, will come and talk to us about that in March. So that'll be a good lecture to end the series with. But as I say, what I want to do this evening is just to run through a number of these themes one by one. I'd be very happy if you want to, ask a question, join in, don't feel you have to. And of course, some of these issues will be picked up in classes and in more detail in the weeks ahead. So this is very much an attempt to encapsulate everything that will be seen in the coming weeks. So I want this week to introduce a number of themes that we'll meet in the weeks ahead: the British Constitution, or the lack of it, Parliament and the Executive, the civil service, the welfare state, human rights and British variants on human rights, local government and centralisation, devolution, which has been obviously a very big and hugely important issue recently. What's interesting about the whole Scottish referendum debate, about which I'll say a bit more in a moment, is that rather in the way the economic crisis back in 2008 had the effect, as far as I could see, of a mass public education in economics and economic theory very quickly, the Scottish referendum had, I think, an analogous effect in terms of teaching people about the British Constitution, or more to the point, about the lack of a written constitution, and indeed about the begging questions about the federal nature of Britain in a country that isn't a federal country, if that doesn't sound too complicated. I mean, it's begged a number of serious questions which we can look at in the coming weeks. And then, of course, very briefly, I want to turn to Britain and Europe. This is not everything you'll be doing in the weeks ahead, just a taster, really. So if I can just begin with the Constitution. As I'm sure you're all aware, Britain has a long evolved system of government and politics. I should have added these slides, as all others will be made available to you on Moodle, so don't feel you have to write them all down, should you wish to. A long evolved system of government and politics with no written constitution. We don't have a formal written constitution. There are very few countries of which this is true, notably New Zealand and Israel. It's also true of them. But of course, we do have a large number of ad hoc, we have legislation, judicial precedents in the courts. So it isn't as if there aren't constitutional principles underlying the way Britain governs itself, but we do not have a codified constitution. And of course, there are a number of commentators, actually a very large number, many based within the school, who believe we should have a written constitution in the UK. We also have a series of institutions which have evolved out of antiquity. Most obviously, the head of state, the monarchy, an unusual, not unique in Europe by any means, but a head of state who is a monarch, a system that has been handed down over, well, depending on where you start, over 1,000 years, and of course a very powerful monarchical-based head of state, which has remained its popularity, partly because, of course, it is cut off from formal power. Doesn't mean it doesn't have an influence, but cut off from formal governmental power, allowing it most of the time to remain above above formal government, and therefore has none of the disadvantages of the unpopularity that politicians can court. We also have a second chamber, the House of Lords, what in other countries might be a Senate, which itself is constituted in a very unusual way. It has its origins, like the monarchy, back in the mists of time. It has its origins in the aristocracy, in a particular form of government that evolved in Britain getting on for 1,000 years ago, but where today what is left, the House of Lords, does look unusual by international standards. So it's a legislative chamber. All legislation goes through the House of Lords as well as the House of Commons. But in doing so, there are checks written into the House of Lords. For example, it can't vote on money bills, and it can only delay bills. It cannot permanently vote them down. The Constitution of the Lords is remarkable in the sense that it's now an extraordinary mixture of the hereditary peers, who until the 1950s were the only ones, so people were only in by birth, and now have been added to them life peers in very large number. I think there's over 1,000 of them in total now. But the remaining 92 hereditary peers, think about this, when one of their, they were left after some reforms that the Labour government pushed through between 1997 and 2010. And for the remaining hereditaries, of course, they sit in party groups. And when the very small groups, Liberal Democrats and Labour, when one of their members dies, then there's a by-election for the remaining ones to choose another one who must be an hereditary peer. So, by the great standards of global democracy, this is unusual, I think we can agree. But it's the way the House of Lords operates. That's our second chamber. And in many ways, I don't want to be overcritical of it, because in many ways it has a distance, it's not elected, therefore it has a bit of distance, and can occasionally discuss issues that the Commons finds too hard to discuss. So there's been a debate in the House of Lords recently about a bill concerning assisted dying, which I think is the kind of bill that only the Lords would really try with that degree of seriousness to look at, because the Commons finds it too difficult. So an extraordinary second chamber. Of course, we have no formal separation of powers in this country between the legislature and the executive. Indeed, the executive, the cabinet, the Prime Minister and the cabinet are derived from the legislature. This is not the way it's done in many countries. We have a formal separation between these things, between these two parts of the state. And of course, until very recently, the judiciary were also appointed by the executive, albeit in a slightly complicated way. That has been reformed. We'll hear more about that from Professor Conor Gearty later this term or early next term soon. And as I hinted a moment ago, on top of all of this inherited and evolved governmental arrangement, over 1,000 years of it, we now have Scotland and Wales, and I'll say a bit more about this in a moment, operating as if they were parts of a federal system. So Scotland now in many ways, and soon will have the powers of an American state or a German land, and yet it actually exists purely at the whim of the House of Commons. It would be possible for Parliament to stop Scottish devolution tomorrow, or Welsh devolution tomorrow. They wouldn't do that, it would be impossible, but nevertheless we have an increasingly federal system of government in a country without a constitution, which isn't anyway a federal country. We're a unitary state. Thought we'd have some pictures just to light relief at this point. Two aspects. So here is a very glorious picture there of the Queen at the state opening of Parliament. This brings together the House of Lords, all those peers in their ermine, and the Queen and Prince Philip sitting on that splendid gold throne. The House of Lords was not bombed between 1939 and 1945, as the House of Commons was. And so this looks as it was built in the 19th century. This is a very grand event when the Queen sits on the throne and reads the government's legislation out. It's amazing. It's lucky, I suppose, that she doesn't have to show emotion, because she can read it out, whoever's in government, whatever the legislation is, straight. And this, of course, is the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition attending. And many of you will, certainly those of you who've seen this, if you live in Britain, will know that the House of Commons is summoned each year to come to stand at the bar in the House of Lords. The bar is not a bar, it is a bar of that kind, where Black Rod goes to the Commons and invites the House of Commons to attend the Lords and there listen to the Queen's speech, the government speech really, and you've got this extraordinary picture of the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition attempting to make small talk to each other, and the Liberal Democrat leader, who's actually in the government, of course, at the moment, just behind, doing the same with Harriet Harman, the Labour deputy leader. So this sort of brings together the Queen. This is the day in the year when all of this sort of process comes together. But of course, it's these people, really, the House of Commons, who have the power. And all of this is to varying degrees less powerful, but part of the system. Now, in Martin Loughlin, Professor Loughlin, who will be speaking later this term, he wrote a book, a very short guide, a very useful book, this short guide to the British Constitution, published very recently, in which he said it might be the case that the British way of muddling through is best suited to the challenges ahead. This is the classic argument for muddling through the British Constitution. Lots of people in the British governmental system like it. This, though, will never satisfy constitutional modernisers, of whom there are also a large number. If Britain is a democracy in which power is exercised in the name of the people, can the Crown still offer an adequate symbol of state? This is precisely the question which was now to be tested in a referendum, this was written before the referendum, on independence for Scotland scheduled for autumn 2014. The Treaty of Lisbon of 2009, it might be noted, requires the EU to respect the constitutional identity of its member states. But do the British still possess the confidence to specify that identity? And it's a good question, and it was begged, I think, by the Scottish referendum. I think it did beg that question, and we'll hear more about that in the weeks and months ahead, I am sure. So I think this begs a challenge. We don't have to answer this today. I just thought we could sort of think about this. Should Britain move to a written constitution, make its remaining unelected state offices fully democratic? If you think about that, that's quite radical in the context of what was up there just now. And more importantly, creating a constitutional identity for the country. And has the Scottish referendum and the outcome of that made this more urgent? So just pause on that thought. Talk more about this with Martin Loughlin and others in the weeks ahead. Feel free if you want to chip in or say anything about this at any point. Now, moving on to Parliament and the Executive. As government has become bigger and more complex, a bigger and more complex activity, read my own note, and prime ministers have become more presidential, Parliament has arguably become less important. We'll hear from Professor George Jones about this. He's written a book about prime ministers, and I think that's his view very broadly, but wait for him to say that. And certainly, for any of you who've watched or will now watch British politics, you'll see that the media concentrate relentlessly on David Cameron, the Prime Minister, Ed Miliband, the Leader of the Opposition, Nick Clegg, the Leader of the Liberal Democrats, much in view this week at the Lib Dems conference in Glasgow, and of course on Alex Salmond, the Scottish First Minister, and ever more so Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, our Mayor of London here in the fair capital. And these people do get an extraordinary amount of coverage and publicity compared with many other parliamentarians and indeed other parts of the political system. Britain has a very national media which reinforces this. Members of Parliament, of whom there are 650, a large number by international standards, have to spend more and more time with their constituents' problems. This is an element of something I'm going to talk about in a moment. Britain is a centralised country, and as more power has been drawn to the centre, it's often the case that constituents, that's any of us who live in a constituency, and we all do within the UK, have to go more often than not to their members of Parliament if, for example, they've got a problem, if you had a problem with a visa or with your housing, they go to the MPs. And that means members of Parliament now have huge amounts of constituency work to do. They hold surgeries. And this means that as they get more power, local government has declined. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, leaving members of Parliament looking more and more locally at their constituents, while these cabinet ministers, Prime Minister, Leader of the Opposition, Prime Minister's Question Time are what most people see as politics. That, I think, begs the interesting question of whether this has something to do with the often discussed disconnect between most people's lives and politics. Politics as seen only on the television is clearly disconnected. It's more like a film in some ways than a real thing. If you were living in Switzerland with cantons and very local politics, you might well see things differently. However, and this is quite a significant however, more recently, select committees, which are subgroups of the House of Commons, committees which have a membership which reflects the membership of the House of Commons by party and have committee chairs who also reflect the balance of the whole House of Commons. So you get a number of Labour chairs, even though the Labour Party is in opposition. They have undoubtedly been able to provide Parliament with teeth. If you look on the excellent, though hard to find, Parliament website, which has a wonderful archive of select committee hearings, you will see a number of select committees digging their teeth into public officials who they think have not done the right thing, broadcasters who you might say it's a bit sort of over theatrical sometimes, but it undoubtedly has seen a rise of the select committee, and with it their chairs as public figures. And many select committee chairs these days are more visible in public life than junior ministers, and that's a big change. Here's an example. That's what most people would think of as politics. Prime Minister's Question Time, soundbite on the 9 o'clock news. Here we've got David Cameron, looks as if he's having fun at the Labour Party's expense, as he often does. There they all sit looking rather glum over there. Sadiq Khan, Alan Johnson, Ed Miliband and Harriet Harman. This is a very typical tableau, and you can see it the other way round some of the time, obviously. But here now, anybody know who this one? This is Mrs. Hodge. Anybody know Mrs. Hodge? She's the chair. Mrs. Hodge, yes, MP for Barking. Very good, well done. Now, quite a lot of people know Mrs. Hodge. Now, Mrs. Hodge is chair of the Public Accounts Committee. She's a Labour MP. This is the most powerful select committee in the House of Commons. It is backed up by the National Audit Office, which is a proper department, which is a parliamentary institution, not a government institution. And Mrs. Hodge has made a real name for herself in holding public servants, particularly those who spend large amounts of public money, to account. And again, National Audit Office reports and Public Accounts Committee reports are a wonderful source, along with House of Commons library notes, if you really want something that's a good source for essays. They're a great source of information about contemporary politics. And I think Mrs. Hodge, but other select committee chairs as well, have done exactly the same thing. Andrew Tyree, who chairs the Treasury Select Committee, he's a Conservative. John Whittingdale at the Media Select Committee, Keith Vaz, the Home Affairs Committee. You'll see all of them now holding the government to account in a way that wasn't true, anything like as true in the past. And that's partly because select committee chairs and members are now elected by MPs themselves. They're not simply appointed by their own party's authorities and whips. Now, the influence of select committees, this is just a quote from a book by Meg Russell and another published in 2011, which says, recent years have been characterised by scepticism, sometimes verging on cynicism, about the effectiveness of the British House of Commons, particularly during the time of large government majorities following the 1997 and 2001 elections. MPs came to be characterised as poodles. For those of you who are long memories, you remember MPs, Labour MPs at the time, it was popularly imagined where you had pages that told them what to do. There was a lot of stuff in the media about this at the time. Doubt was expressed about the extent to which the Commons could have a genuine impact on government policy. And this was reinforced by the fact that during Tony Blair's premiership, the government was defeated only 4 times in the House of Commons. However, the point I was making a moment ago, select committees are taken increasingly seriously by government and have become an established and respected part of the system. So in the unwritten British constitutional arrangements, here we have a check and a balance, really. The evolution of a new check and balance on the relatively powerful executive. And we'll hear more about this in a couple of lectures next term, including from Mrs. Hodge's deputy, who's a Conservative, who will be giving a lecture next term. No, now the challenge here, it seems to me, is should Parliament be given greater powers to act as a check on the executive? For example, by increased support for the opposition. The opposition, remember when you're in government, you've got the whole of the civil service working for you. In opposition, you've got a little bit of money which is made available from public purse to support a tiny research team, but that's about it. And anything you can raise privately. So the government has much more capacity. So more support perhaps for the opposition, more for committees. Though Mrs Hodges' committee, the PAC, has the National Audit Office behind it, other select committees have one or two advisors and some clerks who are very good, but it's not exactly like congressional committees in the United States, which have big teams supporting their members in a way that would be unthinkable in the historically slightly more relaxed House of Commons. Should individual MPs have more support? They now have enormous local post bags and constituency work, and the more they have of that, the less support they've got, less support in relation to what they need, the less time they have to spend doing that other job, because their job is to be a representative in Parliament. They are there in Parliament just as much to be in Parliament as to be back in the constituency. They tend to spend about half the week in each. So, should there be greater powers to act as a check on the executive in this rather centralised constitution-free system? The civil service. We'll be hearing from Professor Kate Jenkins, who's sitting here, about the civil service in a few weeks' time. Britain has developed a large politically independent civil service. It's one of the first places in the world to do this, to move away from cronyism and appointing people's friends to having entry exams and appointment by merit to run the business of government. In this system, I think it's fair to say, until very recently, and there's still a struggle about this, generalised competence has been prized over professional skills. So accountants and economists, for example, not very highly treasured in government traditionally, whereas those with a rounded understanding of the world, with general skills who can move from one department to another, much more prized. Though, in fairness to the civil service, it has been struggling in recent years with how to balance getting more of these experts in without losing the generalised skills. And in fairness, there is a need, I think, for a balance. Cabinet ministers have increasingly appointed SPADs, special advisors. Many of you may have met special advisors. They're an interesting breed. So that allows ministers to bring people into the department and then have them in their outer office, as a sort of direct political contact, working with the civil servants, who are still non-political, of course, delivering the government's objectives, but in a non-political way, but with these special advisors in the outer office. Now, sometimes these relationships work really, really well, and sometimes they work really, really badly, depending on how sensitive the special advisors are and how much the civil servants feel their world is being intruded on by these kinds of special advisors. Some ministers would like to move towards having senior officials who are appointed by the government of the day. And indeed, it's fascinating. There's a story in the Financial Times this morning pointing out how Michael Gove, who used to be the Education Secretary and now has a new role in the government as the leader of the House, I think is he the leader? No, he's not. Chief Whip, sorry, I've got them confusing with William Hague. Chief Whip, thank you. Chief Whip, he has started to attend the weekly meetings of the permanent secretaries. Now, this is a very big and unusual step, not much liked by the civil servants. Thank you for he is indeed the Chief Whip. And that, seeing somebody who is the government's business manager attending the meetings of civil servants is a big and unusual change to have occurred. Now, the civil service can be seen as lacking in management, financial and other expertise. But in fairness to it, its skills as a permanent government or permanent deliverer of government and its lack of political bias are clearly enormously important to the operation of the state. And there are trade-offs here. This is the head of the Cabinet Office. The Cabinet Secretary, Sir Jeremy Hayward stepping out of a car, lots of pictures of him on the internet stepping out of a car for some reason, going into Downing Street, it would appear. And this, of course, here is the fictitious account of life inside government. If any of you have ever seen the thick of it, I thought of playing a clip, but I couldn't find one that I could respectably play. So I didn't, but you can find them. And there's some there's a particularly good one when I was looking for this photograph of life imitating art on the BBC website. It's a BBC clip on YouTube, available through YouTube, which shows how things that happened in the thick of it then happened in real life soon after. So, and of course the thick of it, although having Doctor Who in the front of the picture as well to make it even more odd looking, the thick of it, although of course a satirical take on government, I think you'd find very few people in government who didn't think it had a vestige, a tiny element of certain elements of the way both the previous Labour government and then the current Conservative Lib Dem coalition operate. Perhaps in different ways. This was a bit more shouty, and the early days of the thick of it under the coalition were a bit more new age. But there was a definite, I'm not saying you should watch it to learn British government and politics, but I'm not saying you shouldn't watch it either. Now, just to take on this issue from the Institute for Public Policy Research, who published a long report on this last year and made recommendations for reform. And I'm not saying these are right, but they're just examples of what a commentator, an external commentator might say. You know, that we should give the Prime Minister the power to appoint permanent secretaries, but without politicising the civil service. You can see in that comment there is a paradox, really. Having Prime Minister, you want obviously permanent secretaries whom the government of the day wants to work with, but if they're appointed by the government, there is a risk of politicisation. Providing secretaries of state and ministers who run their own departments with an extended office of ministerial staff that they personally appoint, we're in the same territory here, and who work directly on their behalf in the department. And what you can see here is the tension between the traditional British way of doing things and a sort of cabinet or an American-style government of a kind that looks fine and works right there, but is very different from the traditions that Britain has operated with the independent civil service, the executive taken out of the legislature. They propose strengthening the role of the head of the civil service to hold permanent secretaries to account. The current head of the civil service, who is not Sir Jeremy Hayward, is just about to step down, gave a very interesting speech at the Institute for Government, which is available on their website, about his efforts to hold permanent secretaries to account, if you want to follow that up. The IPPR suggested introducing fixed-term 4-year contracts for permanent secretaries. These are the people at the top of each department, I should have added. Strengthening the external accountability of civil servants in key operational roles. That's what Mrs Hodge has been doing. And then, of course, enabling the civil service to better support opposition parties, again controversial, by allowing officials to be seconded into opposition parties to help them with policy development. So all of these ideas are perfectly sensible, but once you say them, they do tend to, I think, infringe the way many traditional civil servants, or indeed non-traditional, but extant civil servants would imagine their world working, but they may be things that would improve the operation of government and indeed the civil service. So the challenge here, it seems to me, is has the time come to move to a politically appointed civil service of people with professional expertise? Now, it'd be a very different kind of civil service, possibly better, possibly not. Something we can talk about in the weeks ahead. The welfare state. We all know about Britain's welfare state. Many European countries, and indeed others, have either an extant or developing welfare state. Britain has developed a very large set of welfare services, which we call the welfare state, in the years since 1945. The development of a national health service, education for all, social housing, a range of services where there's a social element in the provision. This welfare state now appears to face a number of challenges, not the least of which is, will the public pay the taxes sufficient to fund a full welfare state? Any of you been watching the party conferences recently, you will see this debate subliminally there all the time. famously, the leader of the opposition, you'll remember this, neglected to talk about the deficit, Britain's large deficit. But the Conservatives have been criticised subsequently for promising tax cuts at a time when Britain is indeed still running a very large deficit. The difficulty for all parties is that they've got themselves into a sort of fixed system, almost like a weather system, where the taxes, it appears they are willing to charge or to make people pay, are less than the scale of the state that people want. And I'll show you a chart about this in a moment. Beyond that, we are a consumerist society. It's a cliche, but you know what we mean. We want to consume things. People understand their rights. And those rights are a long way away from the ideas that underlay, for example, the National Health Service back in the 40s. I don't think when the NHS was created and Aaron Bevan, the great Labour politician, created it, that he or anybody else thought that people would, as it were, feel they had the right to demand every new drug that came on the market, or very expensive new drugs. Now, all of us in the room can sympathise with people who feel that if they or a relative is ill, that they should be able to get a new drug from a system that's free at the point of use. But clearly, there isn't limitless money, and consumer attitudes to what we consume may have made the running the state the welfare state more difficult than it once was. Some households, it has been argued, have become dependent on the state. If you look at the scale of what the Beveridge report, the great 1942 report that proposed the creation of a welfare state, the minimal level of unemployment pay and other benefits that it proposed, compared with the scale of welfare today, as of today, the welfare budget, pensions and all others cost more than £200 billion in the United Kingdom. That is a very significant sum of money for a 1.5 trillion, so 1600 billion economy, so it's 200 out of 1600. And there are those who believe that households in some cases have become dependent on the state. And of course, overall, the whole of the welfare state has grown substantially. Not only social security, but the National Health Service, schools, housing, and more besides. Now, this is a classic 1940s style cartoon showing Beveridge attempting to slay the 5 great evils that he saw lying. And it's interesting how creative British public servants were during the Second World War, coming up with a series of reports and proposals for legislation to change the way the country ran, partly because of the cooperation and nationalisation that had gone on during that very Second World War. So want, ignorance, disease, squalor, idleness, these great evils that were to be slayed by the welfare state. More recently, the current Secretary of State, Ian Duncan Smith, you'll have seen him in the news, is trying to introduce a radical new reform to bring many of the welfare benefits other than pensions together into a universal credit, and an attempt, in his view, to reduce dependency. And it's not as if the Labour Party hasn't broadly supported these, so, reduce dependency, but also to remove perverse incentives. Kind of incentives that have existed where people who receive benefits find that as they earn money and come off benefits, they become worse off. So in fairness to Ian Duncan Smith, the objective is clearly one that many people might support, but crucially is very difficult to introduce because of the computer systems and moving from one system to another and the changes in treatment of individuals as that happens. In a book written by another LSE professor, not sadly one who's speaking in this course, but one whose books will be on the reading list, called Understanding the Finance of Welfare, Howard Glenister has written, and this is a very interesting upsum, it seems to me, of the problem that the free at the point of delivery welfare state offers any society. Users of public services seem increasingly dissatisfied, despite the fact that the quality of services has improved since 1950. The level of consumer expectations seems to be rising faster. Discontent may be put down to a malevolent press or professions who continuously talk of a crisis as a way of gaining more resources from the Chancellor. The NHS, of course, has been in crisis ever since it was created, and indeed it's certainly in a square bracket, certainly is today, according to the media this morning. However, there's a more structural explanation for this continuing to get dilemma. Klaus Offer, a German Marxist sociologist, comes closest to capturing it, although there's an equivalent new right explanation. In a pure market economy, the price mechanism manages individuals' expectations. They may desire a Mercedes or a holiday in the Bahamas, but they know their capacity to afford such luxuries is determined by their own worth in the labour market. They do not blame the government. In health and education, where no price is charged, expectations are not managed downwards by the market. Supply and demand have to be managed by the political process. We need to consider the way in which scarce resources are managed and allocated in a non-market system. The dilemmas should not blind us to the fact that all scarce resources have to be rationed. If you look at an institution that many of you live in Britain will know, NICE, which is the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, I think it's changed its name, but near enough, NICE, they have had the problem for some years now of trying to ration the use of drugs, prescribed drugs in the NHS. And once you start talking about rationing, many politicians run away, don't like to talk about rationing. But if you think about it, the NHS has to ration health resources. There isn't a limitless supply of doctors and nurses and pharmaceuticals. So it is all about rationing, and politics is how that has to be done. Now here's the chart I promised. This is my favourite chart at the moment. This is produced by the Office for Budget Responsibility, an excellent organisation with an excellent website, which produces independent economic forecasts and measures of public expenditure. It's just wonderful. And the top line there shows public expenditure as a proportion of GDP in the United Kingdom since 1978-9. It's the dark line, and you can see it up the top there. The lighter line, which is generally below it, is government revenues, that's tax take. And every time the dark line is above the light line, there's a deficit. And on the very, very occasional times when the light line is above the dark line, there's a surplus. So at all times, the dark line's above the light line, the national debt is rising, and of course has been rising substantially. The dotted line marks broadly where we are today, just slightly this way now. And as you can see, what we face is a substantial further fall in public expenditure as a proportion of GDP up to the point the deficit is eradicated. But more interesting that is if you look at the smoothed average of the lower line, the government receipts line, from 1990 to today, it's never got above 38% of GDP. So no government in the United Kingdom has put taxes up above 38% of GDP ever in any year since 1990. That's nearly a quarter of a century. If you listen to the narrative of politics, no desire to put taxes up on most people. Slight desire to put them up on the rich, but not on everybody else. The rich, sadly, are not large enough in number to change that line much. Therefore, Britain has sort of trapped itself. We're not unique in this, but Britain is now trapped in a position of wanting to have, in effect, to put it simply, Sweden or France's public sector with America's taxes. And that's what this chart shows. We want a bigger state than politicians are able to convince us to pay. And that is a real problem, because within the expenditure line, health and welfare is growing, so everything else is having to shrink. Defence has shrunk, local government shrinking, police and fire are shrinking. Big issues. We'll come back to those. I'll be talking about that in a few weeks' time. So, how could the government change the welfare state to ensure it was sustainable, to ration resources, but also that this did not generate unintended consequences? And I think the only answer to that is to put up taxes. I'm not advocating putting up taxes. I'm just saying that unless we are to have much more rationing in the welfare state, we are going to need to put taxes up. And if taxes don't go up as a share of the economy, then we will see substantially more rationing. a story in the Independent today, the Independent newspaper, saying that it may be that one of the professional organisations saying it may be necessary to charge people hotel fees for staying in hospitals. And we'll get more debates of that kind in the coming months and years. Europe. This is not quite as random as I'm sort of moving through the weeks of lectures quickly here in summary. Europe. Now, Europe's been an extraordinarily potent issue dominating British government and politics for 30 or 40 years now. Britain joined the EU in the 70s, had a referendum in 1975 about whether we should stay in or not. And of course, many of you will be aware that a number of British politicians, and indeed an entire new insurgent political party, are lobbying hard for Britain radically to change its relationship with Europe, broadly defined. Now, what we're going to look at within this course is both Europe as an issue of rights and the part of the judiciary and the court system, but also Europe as the European Union. Remembering, of course, and this is a point rarely made in public discourse, that of course the human rights issue and the European Court of Human Rights is nothing to do with the EU, though listening to the debate on these things it'd be hard to differentiate them most of the time. Now, Professor Conor-Gearty will talk about the judiciary and rights and the British approach to rights, but in summary, the way what Britain has done is to adopt, as a number of countries have, many of the elements of the European Convention on Human Rights. They've been incorporated by convention into our and other countries' legal systems, either through constitutional provision or by statute, we don't have a constitution after all, or through judicial processes. And then the European Court of Human Rights, which is not, as I stress, part of the European Union, it hears cases that are alleged to contravene the convention. The cases are heard in the UK courts and other countries' courts, but can in the end be appealed to the European Court of Human Rights. Now, again, those of you who watch the news carefully will know that a number of high-profile cases, often, though not exclusively, involving terrorism suspects, not only that, and occasionally people who've broken the law, have ended up in the European Court of Human Rights and caused not insignificant aggravation to some British politicians. As a result of that, the Conservatives, at their party conference, recently proposed to repeal the Human Rights Act 1998, which was the law by which the Labour government of the time incorporated provisions of the European Convention into British law, so that's how this was done, and instead to produce a Bill of Rights. This would be, in effect, to create something that sounded a bit more English, a Bill of Rights, 1618, going back to history, and trying to escape in part from the European Convention on Human Rights, but particularly, actually not that, but from the court. I just thought a cartoon on this occasion. I like this this is, you can see it here, it says, "It's such relief to ditch the Human Rights Court and get back to common sense," is what the caption is on this particular cartoon from the Daily Telegraph last week. And clearly that is the sense that if we, that among many politicians, and not only in the Conservative Party, if only we could control our own, the decisions of, not just control the decisions of the courts, but if all these cases were decided by British judges, you'd get common sense. I think that's the sort of prevailing feeling. Now, would repealing the Human Rights Act 1998 really make a difference unless the UK withdrew from the convention system under which the European Convention operates? Conor-Gearty, who'll be speaking to you later on in the course, I think argues not. Indeed, he argued not in The Guardian a few days ago. And you might want to argue, and I think it's a moot point, and we'd all have a different view on this, as to whether it's a good or a bad thing that there is a European long stop influencing British law. acting as a sort of an internationally based appeal court for perceived or real injustices within this country. Now, people have different views on that, and we'll hear about that from Conor Gaiety in his lecture. Local government. Now, local government and centralisation. As I said much earlier on, Britain is a unitary and not a federal state with no written constitution. This makes it very easy for national governments of any party to pass laws that affect the powers of subnational government. Now, interestingly, that has led to the creation of devolved Scottish and Welsh and Northern Irish assemblies, but within England, and indeed separately in each of those countries, local government has actually become less powerful. Britain is a highly centralised country, particularly if you look at the share of taxes and political control that are held at Westminster for England, separately in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast for the other three parts of the UK. 95% of all the taxes in the United Kingdom are set by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And if you look at the OECD statistics, beautifully laid out in fabulous charts, so you can see how Britain compares with UK compares with other countries in OECD, you'll find that this is a very low percentage indeed. And indeed, as the 5%, which is a local property tax, is frozen and capped, it's really 100%. So here we are in a large, mature democracy with 100% of all the taxes set by national government. Very, very unusual, as OECD helpfully shows. England has had no devolution, even though England's a country of 52 million people, Scotland 5, Wales 3, Northern Ireland 1.5 million people, no devolution within England. Labour government did try a referendum in the north-east to introduce devolved regional government there in 2004, but the powers on offer were so modest that the people of the north-east, in my view, with good reason, rejected it. So what we have seen latterly is new forms of local governance emerging, efforts to sort of get round this at city regional level and in other subnational units that are not quite new government units, but do provide an opportunity for some more effective operation as an area wider than one local authority. Pratchett and Wilson, writing about local democracy and local government, say that a vital element of the constitutional mix, the local element, has withered and is danger of disappearing altogether, even more pessimistic than I was just then. The centralisation of many services, the circumvention of local government, and the diminution of local politics have all compounded to foster a democracy that increasingly ignores and belittles all things local and which gives excessive emphasis to national politics, going back to the pictures and some of the points I made earlier. The persistently low turnout at local elections and the tendency for them to be used as indicators of national party preferences are symptomatic of this trend. The practice and habits of democracy at the local level, which remains the foundation of our national democratic culture, are in retreat. And in fact, this is quoted by Pratchett and Wilson, but it's the foreword by Sir Simon Jenkins, great columnist in The Guardian, in his foreword to that book. And I think that's a pretty fair comment, but we can talk about that in the weeks ahead. Here the challenge is, does the centralisation of power in England weaken local government in ways which in turn undermine local politics and thus the basis for national political parties? And that's a very, if you think about it, an interesting question. All politics is local. Not my original idea, an American politician said that. All politics is local. And the truth is, if local government erodes and erodes, where would the basis of national politics be? All members of Parliament are selected by local party members. Local party members look to local government, many of them are councillors, and without that local government functioning healthily, how would the parties survive? They're already shrinking. How would they survive without that local unit of government? So there is a link between local government and politics and national politics. Devolution. Now, I've touched on this already. Scotland and Wales have been given their own parliament and government. This was a radical change, and I said it was. We can discuss, or we will discuss further into the course, how this happened. It's very centralised state, the United Kingdom, suddenly after 1997, with the advent of a Labour government, then devolving power to Scotland and Wales. A number of reasons for this. It had been tried earlier, in fact, in the 1970s, and had been rejected. And I should say it was rejected in Wales, but not in Scotland. But I'll explain when we get there. I don't want to go all the way back through 1979 again. There was a threshold, I think was the point. There was a threshold at the time, and that was very nearly an issue the other week, of course. There was a threshold above which the Scots would have had to get to trigger the devolution that was proposed in the late 70s. So virtually all domestic policy is now handled by Edinburgh and Cardiff. Edinburgh and Cardiff now have extraordinary powers, and indeed Belfast, the Northern Ireland Assembly has analogous and significant powers, which, given the extraordinary history of Northern Ireland, just shows you how radically things have changed there. That there's been devolution to a Northern Ireland Assembly which is not available within England, and that is a real signal about how Northern Ireland has moved on. Major taxation powers are to be handed over to Scotland following the 2014 referendum. Those of you who were watching the referendum within the last few weeks will have seen Gordon Brown, our former Prime Minister, suddenly appearing as the great hero of the No campaign, it would appear, to offer on behalf of the Labour, Conservative and Liberal Democrat parties much greater taxation power for Scotland, power to borrow money, welfare freedom, freedom to operate the welfare, or part of the welfare system, much more radical even than the Scots had already been offered. So what the Scots are going to get is the thing that was originally refused to them in the questions on the ballot paper, a sort of Devo Max option, as it was called, which will make Scotland, in my view, akin to a federal unit within a federal state. But of course we're not a federal state, as I said earlier. But the Scots will have very significant autonomy, including, crucially, not only budgeting autonomy, but now tax-raising powers as well. The Scottish Conservative leader came up with the most radical suggestion, intriguingly, to devolve all income tax to Scotland, the whole of income tax. And that would make it a very, very devolved system indeed. And we're now in the process of the Westminster system having to decide exactly what it now offers Scotland on the back of this. Wales, of course, will ask for something similar. Wales has already been promised tax-raising powers, but you can see that on the back of whatever Scotland is now given, Wales, which is in a slightly different situation because it's a less affluent country in terms of its tax-raising capacity, but the Welsh will similarly be offered at least some form of a local income tax and other tax-raising powers. So, how do we create this federal, devolved system of countries, these nations within the United Kingdom, when the UK isn't a federal state? And more than that, what about England? England is 52/62 in terms of population and GDP, of the United Kingdom. Professor John Curtis, the great cephalological expert from Strathclyde University, I remember speaking at a lecture in London about 5 years ago, long before all of this was going on, making the point that the only way for a United Kingdom which consists of one country which has 52 million people in it, one with 5, one with 3 and 1 and 1.5, the only way that can hold together is if at some level the Scots, the Welsh and the Northern Irish have more power than their numbers suggest, to try to balance out the imbalance that would otherwise occur with England being so dominant. An interesting idea. I credit it to him. I hope I remember that correctly, but it's a good idea. And so in recent times, Scotland, after all, has higher levels of public expenditure than England. So does Wales, so does Northern Ireland. They have more representation in Parliament than Scotland, and of course their own government, as Wales and Northern Ireland do. Perhaps that's an essential condition for allowing the United Kingdom to continue. But that begs the question of what happens if you did give, and this is being discussed as we speak, England greater autonomy. There are Conservative and other MPs who think England should have its own parliament with its own ministers, with a First Minister, an English First Minister perhaps, like the Scottish First Minister. Well, then the budget of the English government would be bigger than the remaining UK government, and that would be a bit lopsided, wouldn't it? It'd be a bit like as if California were, I don't know, had a bigger budget than the US federal government or something like that. It doesn't kind of make sense if you sort of think it through. So what will come out of all of this, I suspect, though this will happen during the course of our lectures, so this will be in real time, is another British constitutional fudge of some kind. It'll be a mixture of some English votes for some English laws or parts of that, but probably not an English Parliament. But we'll see. These debates will be going on in real time around us. A cheery picture here before the referendum, actually, of the Prime Minister meeting the First Minister. Perhaps I should have said the First Minister meets the Prime Minister, would have been more accurate given which side of they're standing, with a handsome map of Scotland behind them. I think this was at the point where they decided to hold the referendum. And these are two quotes which I won't read out now because we're running short. Well, we're beginning to run towards 6:15, but it's really the SNP's arguments distilled here for Scotland becoming an independent nation, and the UK government's arguments for maintaining the partnership better together. We'll have a lecture from Professor Jim Gallagher about this, who took part in this campaign. I think he was actually involved, and no secret here, on the No campaign, but he will give a very independent view of this, I'm sure, as he did when he spoke last year. So, fascinating one. For me, I don't know if any of you, for me, anybody here vote in this referendum, by the way, just as a matter of interest? No? I'm not Scottish. I was born in Wales, as it happens. But as a UK voter, I found this referendum the most exciting election in my life, more than general elections. I don't know if any of you shared that view. So even if you weren't Scottish or voting in the Scottish referendum, it was nevertheless an electrifying activity. And as the earlier mentioned Professor Curtis said at another seminar here a few weeks ago, why was the turnout so high? Well, simply because the result mattered. 85% turnout, 97% registered votes, an extraordinary election, and the result mattered. And I'm afraid the implication of this is turnouts are lower in other elections because people think they don't matter. That's the other side of that tragic coin. So, challenge. Was it good or bad for Scotland, and in what ways, that it did not vote for independence? This is something that the Scots and the remainder of the UK, I think, will debate for a long time to come. They may want to have another go at it. Let's not rule that possibility out. Depends what the UK government now offers them and how that system works thereafter. Will it be like Quebec, where there was a second referendum? And will whatever comes out of this be good or bad for England? More power for Scotland, more power for Wales, more power for Northern Ireland? What will the English get out of this? The English, who are this large majority, who generally don't assert themselves, but who may be about to some extent, the way the English do it. Now, Britain and Europe. As I said earlier, no issue more vexed over the long term than Britain's relationship with Europe. It's a complex relationship and often a different one. Britain had an in-out referendum soon after we joined having not joined the European community originally, then joined late and had a referendum soon after to decide whether or not we should stay in the EU. Euroscepticism, you'll hear a lot more of this from Simon Hicks next term, drives a number of Conservative and UKIP politicians as a significant fringe to the Conservative Party, the whole of UKIP, an insurgent party within the UK mainstream, and, to be fair, some Labour ones. There's only one party, I'm not advertising it, I'm just saying as a matter of fact, one party that's now foursquare pro-EU or pro-Europe, broaden it, and that's the Liberal Democrats. They've got a number of things where they are unique, and this is one of them. The Lib Dems are a pro-European party. Labour, some way back across the spectrum, the Conservatives some way from them, and UKIP well beyond them, on some kind of spectrum. I think that's fair to all concerned. It's hard not to be aware of the fact that the British media are often highly critical of the EU and other European institutions, whether or not they're part of the EU. Many of you will be aware of the endless fabled stories about, the need to have straight bananas and all of this nonsense that gets in the media from time to time and all of that sort of stuff. There's a lot of it. But public opinion is regularly split. Actually, it's generally in favour. If it's pushed, generally, pushed decision, we'll generally say that people on balance would like to stay in the EU. Of course, though, we now operate in a world where the Conservative Party in particular, and UKIP, but the Conservatives are committed that if they win the next general election outright, the election next year, they'd hold an in-out referendum as to whether the UK should stay, albeit on terms that would have been renegotiated by David Cameron, by the Conservatives in the meantime. UKIP just wants an in-out referendum to, I think, in fairness to them, just to argue to leave. Labour's position is more nuanced. The Liberal Democrats, I think, are discussing whether or not they should have a referendum or should support the idea of a referendum. Because frankly, whether you believe in staying in or getting out, a referendum could be seen, at least for a while, as clearing the air. So whether you're on either side of the argument, you might think, let's just stop the argument for a bit. Whether it would or not is another matter. But clearly, we may well face a referendum within the next 2 years. And what the Scottish referendum tells us, 3 years, what the Scottish referendum tells us is that there are consequences in terms of the instability or the perceived instability of the country's political and financial institutions. Now, whether it's fair or not, you could see from the latter days of the Scottish referendum, when it was thought that it was possible the Scots would vote yes to leave the UK, that, we suddenly started hearing about banks thinking of moving their headquarters and less investment and all sorts of, fires of Hades pouring down if this happened. Now, whether it would have been like that, we'll never know. But all I can say is that on the basis of that experience, when this debate happens about Britain and the EU, it's hard not to believe we'll get the same kind of it'll all go to the dogs or it won't go to the dogs kind of debate. So it'll be I think the Scottish referendum, absolutely important and vital in its own right, was also revealing in what it tells us about how a referendum on Britain staying in or leaving the EU might turn out. So many good pictures when you come to look at Britain and Europe available. This is a classic of President Mitterrand, Mrs. Thatcher, probably looking the other way to talk to somebody, but when cropped like this, it simply looks like a metaphor for everything to do with Britain's relationships with, well, not only Europe, but also France, I'm afraid. But there we are. It is just an undying issue in British politics. We have 2 lectures on this from Simon Hicks, Professor Hicks, next term. Now, this is what David Cameron thinks the choice is, and he is in an interesting position because he's placed himself, I think, as somebody who would want to vote to stay in the EU, but is also the person whose party includes many people who want to leave it and who has to negotiate, if there is this in-out referendum and he's still Prime Minister, with Europe, which I have to say doesn't show that much sign on wanting to make life easy for the British. But let's see what he said at Bloomberg 18 months ago. A real choice between leaving or being part of a new settlement in which Britain shapes and respects the rules of the single market but is protected by fair safeguards and free of the spurious regulation, the bananas, which damages, I added that obviously, damages Europe's competitiveness. A choice between leaving or being part of a new settlement in which Britain is at the forefront of collective action on issues like foreign policy and trade, and where we leave the door firmly open to new members. A new settlement subject to the democratic legitimacy and accountability of national parliaments, where member states combine in flexible cooperation, respecting national differences, not always trying to eliminate them, in which we have proved that some powers can in fact be returned to member states. The British want to repatriate powers. Most other countries, particularly France and Germany, want to do the opposite. In other words, a settlement which would be entirely in keeping with the mission for an updated European Union I have described today. More flexible, more adaptable, more open, fit for the challenges of the modern age. And to those who say a new settlement can't be negotiated, I would say listen to the views of other parties in our European countries arguing for powers to flow back to European states. Well, I'm not absolutely sure the core countries are. Some of the others might be. But of course, beyond this, what's further added since he made this speech, really, to the piquancy of this whole debate is the question of immigration. Immigration in unprompted opinion polling in Britain. Maury does regular unprompted, it's done it for years, unprompted questions. What do you think are the most important issues in Britain today? Number one is immigration. The Conservatives, when they were in opposition, and the Conservative Lib Dem coalition, have brought down or sought to bring down the level of immigration from outside the EU, but of course within the EU there is free movement of labour. That is how it works, free movement of capital and labour. And so as immigration from outside the EU has declined, immigration from inside the EU has gone up. And this means that for Mr Cameron and for other British politicians, it's not going to be so different for the Labour Party, frankly, they face the problem that the EU issue is tangled up with immigration, which is a much more salient and potent issue even than Europe, arguably. And so when it comes to these renegotiations, and it's not really mentioned in this long quote, the idea that, he says in this speech, the door firmly open to new members, I'm not absolutely sure it'll be the door firmly open to new members with the rights to move backwards and forwards across international boundaries, but we'll see. Very complicated issue with the Prime Minister right at the heart of it. So, the big issues, it seems to me, with Europe is what are the issues and history, because there's history in this, that lie beneath Britain's strained relationship with the EU, and might renegotiation and an in-out referendum finally sort things out. Well, if I can offer a personal view here, and I shouldn't be doing this too often, I doubt it'll ever be finally in Britain's case. Even if there were a referendum, it's hard to believe it would be finally. And this is just one of those recurring questions which will probably stay with Britain for a long time to come, whether or not there is such a referendum. Now, just finally, this is by no means a full list, but in looking ahead to the coming year, some of the essays that will need to be written and so on, there are so many institutions and other, well, not all, these are all institutions in various ways, but all of them are relevant and are being reformed. The British Constitution, permanently in flux. The Lib Dems are discussing it on and off at their party conference up in Glasgow. The role of the monarch, regularly discussed. There's a play showing in the West End about the imagined early days of King Charles III. The role of the monarch, permanently under debate. Perhaps less so with the current Queen as head of state, but it's always an issue for some people. House of Lords, very much more as an issue of current debate. Should it be reformed? I think overwhelmingly there's a belief it should. The difficulty is nobody can think of an option that everybody would agree with, and therefore it's hard to do anything. House of Commons, a number of reforms have been made to the business practices of the House of Commons, but not much more than that. Could it operate on more modern procedures? Well, yes. The British legislative processes, which I haven't touched on at all today, are complex, as they are in many countries. We have many more acts of parliament than we once did, and the process itself has been regularly criticised for being it's not only obscure but often rushed. And we now have new processes like the consideration of draft bills. There's a lot of things going on there. Select committees we've talked about. The major political parties, well, we have, the Conservative Party, the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats are all in their way, and if you can see this in the current opinion polls, they are all unpopular at the same time. It's very unusual to have your three traditional major parties unpopular at the same time. Normally you'd get the government unpopular and the opposition's popular. Well, actually, all three are in the polls at the moment. That's partly because there are insurgent parties, particularly UKIP, but also, here and there, the Greens. So UKIP to the right of these three, the Greens to the left of these three. Interesting to wonder if there were a Labour government, we'll find out that before the end of the academic year just, if there were a Labour government, whether the Greens would become a bigger party of protest if the Lib Dems didn't fulfil that protest, didn't have that job at the time. Manifestos. Well, we'll be running into manifesto season. The textual analysis of manifestos and what governments then do with them, always interesting. Lobbyists. We've had, in the last year, legislation to try to curtail the activities of lobbyists. There are many lobbyists out there now, and I don't just mean lobbying companies. Most big companies have their own in-house lobbyists. There are many companies that do this. Some of you may want to go and work in such companies in years ahead. They are an important element in the political system and have many interesting people working in them. Elections, turnout and voting. School has, the LSE government department has initiative running on this, and we will be, I should say, in the run-up to the general election, doing a lot more, many more activities, including a conference on the general election on Friday the 13th of March. Just remember that date, Friday the 13th, when else? Next year. And we will be doing more on opinion polls and posters. There's more opinion polls than any time in history. London has great access to opinion polls and posters. The school has good relations with them. They are an opportunity for us all. Civil service, Downing Street and the Treasury, all subject to sort of near permanent debate about whether they should change and be reformed. Didn't talk much about Downing Street today. Large books are written by just about not only about the day-to-day working of Downing Street, but some people about the layout of desks and doors in Downing Street and how these things matter to the way power is used in the British political system. And the Treasury, the all-powerful Treasury, at the top of the UK's finance ministry. And then finally the subnational institutions, not by any means last but not least, which I've touched on already, including in London with its extraordinary mayoral system led by Boris Johnson, recently selected to become a parliamentary candidate in the next general election. And then, of course, London is the British capital of think tanks. Those of you, if I can just make a suggestion, want to meet large numbers of interesting people in the evenings for free and debate all sorts of issues. There are dozens of think tanks within 2 miles of here, all of whom would love to see you for their events. The IPPR, Policy Exchange, Social Market Foundation, Centre for Social Justice, Compass, there's loads and loads of them. I'd avail yourself of them. But crucially, they too are a subject worthy of study in their own right. Their influence on politics these days, very important. Next week, which will be the first lecture in the series, we will hear about the philosophical influences and the history of ideas from Professor Paul Kelly. I haven't talked about this today at all. This will give us an introduction to the philosophy and ideas that underpin British politics, government and its constitutional development, and also looking at some of the recent and contemporary influences on today's political leaders.